बराबर है तूने तो
ये इधर होता है तो कैसे करना है इसको? अच्छा
निकल गया
अच्छा Yeah, it's maybe we can put the mic on then this thing because it'll be heavy then. Maybe that's what it is. That's what it is.
That's my guess.
हो गया
Yeah, back here.
Make sure it doesn't move off. Yeah, कसी है.
है ना ये तो
आगे भी कर लेते हैं थोड़ा सा. आगे करूँ?
करो करो
Let me move.
बस नहीं
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Before we begin, let's take a moment to recite one Surah Fatiha, 3 times Ikhlas, for all of our marhumin, for those who have passed away and have no one to make dua, and especially by the right of tonight and tomorrow, that may Allah give peace to all those who have left us. Surah Al-Fatiha.
चाहिए
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين، واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أحسب الناس أن يتركوا أن يقولوا آمنا وهم لا يفتنون. آمنا بالله، صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. صل على محمد. Your second salawat for love of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. And your loudest salawat to hasten the master of our time, Sahibul Asri wa Zaman. We're continuing in our series of 12 questions around the event of Karbala. And the significance of this series and the significance of these questions being some things that we take for granted and we don't think about when we think about the event of Karbala, and understanding some of the wisdom behind the event of Karbala and understanding the actions of the Imam. Now understand something, as we have this conversation, the reason this conversation is necessary is that sometimes as you hear about the event of Karbala, you wonder to yourself, why didn't the Imam do this? Or why did the Imam do this? And one thing that we accept is that every action that the Imam performed was perfect. An Imam does not make mistakes. An Imam does not accidentally wind up somewhere, and the Imam doesn't afterwards think that, oh, that was a good idea. The Imam always knows the exact right thing to do in every situation. And he does exactly the right thing in every situation. But one of the things that happens for us is when we hear the story of Karbala from the pulpit, we hear pieces of the story, not the entirety of the story. And as a consequence, some things can be left unclear for us, and some things can be confusing. So this, as an opportunity, is to discuss some of those points and affairs associated with the event of Karbala, to clarify some of the doubts, the mistakes, misunderstandings that we have. And as such, we'll begin the conversation with the first of our questions, with your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Who was with Imam Hussain in the field of Karbala? Now this question, the reason that I asked this question is that in the popular retelling we hear from the pulpit, there are some personalities who escape mention. And just because they're not mentioned doesn't mean that they weren't there. Sometimes the details about these personalities are unclear, and we want to understand better. If I was to give you an example, one of these points is the fact that there were actually 4 sons of Imam Hassan present in the field of Karbala. 4. We only talk about Hazrat Qasim being present, but that doesn't mean that these others weren't present. And as a matter of fact, we know that the oldest of these 4 sons was known as Hassan al-Muthanna. Hassan al-Muthanna fought in the field of Karbala, was injured to the point where they thought that he had died, but at the end of the battle they uncovered that Hassan al-Muthanna was alive, and his uncles from his mother's side saved his life. And today, if we have Sadat, who are, if you ever heard of Tabatabai, Sayyid Tabatabai, those are the children of Imam Hassan, who lived through the experience of Karbala and were the grandchildren of this Hassan al-Muthanna, the son of Imam Hassan. So meaning that just because we don't talk about them doesn't mean that they weren't present. As a matter of fact, they were. Same way when we talk about the family of Imam Hussain, there are a number of people who are from the children of Imam Hussain who were present. Same way, for example, Hazrat Muslim ibn Aqil. After the event of Karbala, there's one person who sees that Imam Zainul Abidin, when he's in the city of Medina, used to visit some of his cousins more than the others. And it turned out that the cousins that the Imam would visit were the children of Aqil and less the children of Ja'far. Now Imam Ali's 2 brothers, Aqil and Ja'far, both were important figures in the history of Islam. But Imam Zainul Abidin winds up spending more time in the house of the children of Aqil than he does in the house of Ja'far. Someone asks him, Ya Ibn Rasulullah, why do we find that you spend more time with the family of Aqil than you do with the family of Ja'far? And the Imam explains that the family of Aqil and the children of Muslim made more sacrifices in the cause of my father's battle in Karbala than the children of Ja'far, so they have experienced more loss, so I spend more time to comfort them. It wasn't to say that, for example, one was necessarily better, but the fact that these people were present. So one of the places where the conversation comes and the question comes, who from amongst the children of the Imam was present? Now when it comes to the daughters of the Imam and the women of the household of the Imam, very limited amount of information is known to us, because that was the nature of hijab and haya in those times, is that you didn't know when a daughter was born, so which is why we still have doubts about the dates of the birth dates of many of the women in the household of the Prophet. Their attributes were unknown, and their time, even as prisoners, their information is very little known to us. For example, there are certain speeches and comments that all they do is they say, Qalat Zainab. Now let me explain something where that gets into confusion, is that Bibi Kulthum was her laqab, her name was Zainab. And Sayyidah Zainab al-Kubra, her name was Zainab. So many times the historian is simply writing a name, and the other thing is that the historian who's writing these events, he's not going to go up to the lady and say, who are you? I want to write this down. It's against the etiquette. So they made some assumptions in the process of writing history, which is why there's a lot of details that are unknown to us about the women of the household. Another example of this is, for example, the 4-year-old daughter of Imam Hussain. If you look at our traditions, her name is Sakina. But if you look at, for example, the Persian culture or the Arab culture, she's referred to as Ruqayya. Now, how these two coincide is there's actually a discussion or debate that says that she was referred to as Sukaina or Sakina before the event of Karbala, and she was known as Ruqayya, one who cries and one who is bereft, after the event of Karbala. That this was more of a description of who she was than necessarily a name that she possessed. It's a discussion. We don't know the reality of this. The same way, for example, a contemporary conversation that has popped up is amongst the sons of Imam Hussain. The sons of Imam Hussain that are well known are 3 in the field of Karbala. But in history, if you take a look at the Tariq of Abi Makhnaf and you take a look at the other Mu'arrikhin, they actually list at least 4 sons. The 4th son is the one who is born on the day of Ashura and is killed by an arrow in the hands of Imam Hussain in front of the tents. Now there was a son who was born that day, and that he was killed that day as well too. The other three sons that we talk about, our fourth Imam, Ali ibn al-Hussain Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, salawat ala Muhammad wa his second son that we refer to as Ali al-Akbar, and his third son that we refer to as Ali al-Asghar. A contemporary conversation that has shown up that says and has the discussion, which was older, Ali Akbar or Ali Abid as he's called, or Imam Zain al-Abidin. Now the purpose of this argument, which is, again, and I'll explain how, the purpose of this argument is simply a historical semantic conversation. It doesn't in any way change the reality or the greatness of their sacrifices, nor of the azamat of their personalities. The reason this debate exists, if I was to explain to you, you guys are okay? You guys want to hear some of this? You guys all right? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The entirety of why this debate exists is that a personality would be given a biography when it became older. Meaning that when you were 40, 50, 60, and you became a shakhsiyah, personality in society, and you were known for your good character, a biography would be written about who you are, where you came from, and what you did. These were young men who were shaheed in the field of Karbala. Meaning the time that it takes for them to be known in society and for people to acknowledge their brilliance and their greatness was very limited. And therefore very few people were associated with these characters and didn't know much about the nobility of this family. So the consequence of this was that there's ishtibah, there's doubts about who was who and what was what. Now, amongst Sunni historians like Tabari, they list and they say that Imam Zain al-Abidin was the second son and Ali al-Akbar was the older. And they do this on the basis of a few narrations, one that comes from the court of Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, where it's said that as Ubaidullah asks who is Imam Zain al-Abidin, he says, didn't you have an older brother who was killed in Karbala? Wasn't there another Ali that was killed and he was older than you? And Imam Zain al-Abidin simply replies and he says that if my father had many sons, he would have named us all Ali. This hadith is not narrated in Shia sources, but rather in Sunni tarikh. And it's narrated by Sunni historians and there's not Shia narrators associated with it, which is why we don't put a lot of weight on this hadith. Another hadith that mentions and describes Imam Zainul Abidin as the younger son is a hadith from his youth that someone came to Imam Hussain and asked him, who will be the Imam after you? And the Imam points to his son and the narrator writes, he says, he pointed to his son, وَكَانَ عَلِيٍّ صَغِيرٍ. And this Ali was a little Ali, that he was young. The narrator is saying it, not the Imam. Now the fact that this happens many years before the event of Karbala and what the situation was, and that the narrator is making the decision to call him that this Ali was little, doesn't give us enough information to actually say that this was the younger of the two sons that the Imam possessed at the time. Those who look at history as a general text can come to the conclusion and say that Ali al-Akbar was the oldest. However, many and cross-culturally, Shia narrators and those who have learned of the pulpit and the mimbar and the mention of these masa'ib have always referred to Ali al-Akbar as the second son. And there are a few points to this. One that points to it on the basis of the fact that Imam Zain al-Abidin had children by this point in time. Ali al-Akbar did not have children. Even the wife of Imam Zain al-Abidin was known. These details about Ali al-Akbar are unknown. So it points to the fact that it makes sense that if the middle son, if Imam Zain al-Abidin was the middle son, then the eldest son should have children older. And we know that Imam Zain al-Abidin had children because our fifth Imam, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Baqir alayhi salam, was present in Karbala and was at the age of 3, and he's one of the authentic narrators of the event of what happens on the day of Ashura. So meaning that Imam Zain al-Abidin's children are present and part of the event of Karbala, yet there's no similar mention to wives and children of Ali al-Akbar who would be present in the field as well. However, what's the fruit? What's the thamara of the conclusion? It's irrelevant to the facts. It doesn't in any way change the position and the mansab of imamat, nor the sacrifice of Ali al-Akbar. Rather, what we say is that he's referred to as Ali al-Akbar because he was the elder of the Alis, the sons of the Imam who were killed in the field of Karbala. The same way that, for example, one of the titles of Hazrat Abbas is Saqqai Bani Hashim, the one who quenches the thirst of Bani Hashim. And this title too was something that was given to Hazrat Abbas after the event of Karbala, because his sacrifice was presented in the process of going to quench the thirst of Ahlul Bayt. But all of these don't impact our ability to connect, to relate, and to learn the lessons that are being taught in the event of Karbala. So therefore, being caught up in this conversation may be a historically interesting conversation. It may be something that aligns us with going back and researching the events of history, but it doesn't change our relationship with Ahlul Bayt. And therefore, when we look at conversations we want to pay attention to, we have to give priority to things that are more important, that change and teach us about how to follow the example of Ahlul Bayt, that make us connected to them. Now, as a transition, our second question, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And this is where we start paying attention to this transition of looking at the why. And it begins with a question that starts with how, but you'll see the significance as we get to it. How did Imam Zainul Abidin live through the event of Karbala? Now, one answer to this is the fact that the Imam was sick. And the question comes, how was the Imam sick? What made the Imam sick? There's a debate that goes on and says that it was a short-term sickness that had come on. Some of our narrators of the event say that the Imam Zainul Abidin, was so powerful that in the preparation for the event of Karbala, he was tearing chainmail with his bare hand. And he received a wound from that tearing of chainmail, and it became the source of his sickness. The discussion around the sickness of Imam Zainul Abidin is very interesting because there are a number of different opinions about it. There are, for example, from the Zaydi sect. Sayyid Jalali Marhum, who used to live in Chicago, wrote a book about the tariq and the history of Imam Zainul Abidin, and in it he mentions that the Zaydi sect actually came up with a different way of the Imam being injured. And they said that the fourth Imam actually fought on the day of Ashura, became wounded, and that was the source of his sickness. We don't accept this. It's interesting to note because the Zaydi sect, which doesn't follow the Jaffari 12 school of thought that we possess, insists that every Imam has to be someone who fights against the oppressors. And one of the places that they had a difficulty was that they followed Zayd ibn Ali, the brother of Imam al-Baqir, but they wouldn't follow Imam Baqir because they say Imam Baqir didn't make war. So the argument would be presented to them, well, what about Imam Zainul Abidin? He didn't make war either. So they came up with this series of narrations and they said that no, Imam Zainul Abidin too went to war and fought, and that's what his injury was from. We don't agree with this. What we believe is that the injury was necessary, or not the injury, the sickness in the Imam was necessary for the condition of imamah to remain on this earth. Let me explain why. On the day of Ashura, very famously, our Imam calls out, "Ala hal min nasirin yansurna?" Is there anyone to help us? That call of the Imam made it wajib on every able human being to answer the call of the Imam and to support the Imam. If we were to take a look at, for example, that in the army of Umar Sa'd Mal'un, there were 30,000 people. Maybe some of those people never raised a sword against the Imam. Maybe they were, they didn't want to be there, but they were forced to be there. Should they be punished? This call of the Imam was proof that they would be punished and will be punished. That this call of the Imam insisted that anyone who was present who could hear the voice of the Imam, it was wajib upon them to answer, with the exception of the fact that you were physically incapable or not of the age to respond to the call of the Imam. The only way that Imam Zainul Abidin could have been in the field of Karbala and not fought was that he was not able to answer the call of the Imam. Otherwise, we would say the imamat and the silsila of imamat is void. That means that we made someone imam, na'uz billah, who didn't complete a wajib action that was wajib upon him. So his sickness was something that was necessary, but that's not the only way that the imam survived the event of Karbala. And this is where it gets interesting. You see, the army of Umar Sa'd didn't care about the life of the value of the life of any of Imam Hussein's children. That's why when Imam Hussein presents Ali al-Asghar in the field of Karbala, and he says, give him water, that child is innocent. But what happens? The army says, we won't give him water. This event was very interesting because it caused a fight in the army of Umar Sa'd. Ali Asghar, his shahadat almost breaks the army and causes a civil war in the army of Umar Sa'd. And the reason was, it was a discussion about how inhumane the army was willing to be. One of the things that we don't talk about is that when the Imam presents Ali al-Asghar, he says, oh, listen, army of Umar Sa'd, this son of mine, who is 6 months old and has been thirsty for 3 days, is going to die anyway. There's no way a child who is 6 months old lives without food for 3 days. The Imam's plea for water for Asghar is, he says, don't let him die thirsty. This is what caused the fight. Is that the army of Umar Sa'd, some of them turned and said, give the infant water. Our goal is that none of Hussein's family should live after this event. This child will not live. And others amongst the army said, even walau kana dhalik, even if he does not live, we won't give him water. That's what started the fight amongst them. Is that, are we really that inhumane? That an infant who's dying, and we know is going to die, our goal will be completed, that we won't give him water? And the other half of the army was arguing and saying that no decency will be accounted for the family of Hussein on this day. And that's where the debate was. Now, understanding that debate, when we look at the example of the fourth Imam who was in the field of Karbala, though he is sick, the indecency of the army should have been such that how then did they leave the Imam alive? And it's an interesting question, that if they're willing to kill infants, then why did they stop at someone who was sick? The being sick of Imam Zainul Abidin was not enough in that moment that he would live through the experience of Karbala. Which is why after the shahadat of Imam Hussain, we see that Umar Sa'd comes to the tent and commands for the murder of Imam Zainul Abidin as well too. What was the necessity of the time that saved his life was that Sayyidah Zainab came forward and said, you will have to kill me first if you intend to kill him. Now, all of the decency and bravery of the Arab to one side, the one thing that they couldn't do in that time was kill a woman. That you could not be a soldier, a warrior in history whose name could be written that you intentionally in an act of war killed a woman. Not possible. That, accompanied with the fact that the Imam was sick, is what gave the ability for the Imam to live through the event of Karbala. Had it been that either one of these causes had been missing, one, if the Imam wasn't sick, the answer to Imam Hussain would have been wajib and the Imam would have had to enter the battlefield and fight. Two, the indecency of the army was such that they did not offer dignity even to one who was sick on his bed. They attempted to kill him. It was only the fact that Sayyidah Zainab insisted that you must kill me first if you intend to kill my nephew, that stopped the hand that no one wanted to have it written in history that we killed women in a battlefield. This example of Sayyidah Zainab saving Imam Zainul Abidin didn't just happen the day of Ashura. It happens in the court of Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad as well. That Ubaidullah again, seeing the Imam in front of him, intends to kill the Imam. And Sayyidah Zainab again stands up and she makes the claim and she lays the claim outright and she says, to kill him you have to kill me first. And even Ubaidullah is overcome. He says, how loving the relationship between the aunt and the nephew. And he lets go of the affair that he says, I will not have written on my hands that I am someone who executes women. This whole story brings an interesting point. You guys okay? Everybody interested? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. There's a discussion that says that the enemies will become worse with time. And that the enemies of this time of Ahlul Bayt will be worse than the enemies of the first time. And this is a debate and discussion. In this debate, in this discussion, they say that, you see, the enemies of the first time had certain limits of things that they would not do. And even as evil as these men were, the killing of women was something they would not do. And they point to it and they say that closer to the ends of time, humanity will devolve so much that there will be no limit and they will be even more evil than the initial times. You ask, how? How is that possible? One of the examples that's given is the example of Shaheed Baqir al-Sadr. Shaheed Baqir al-Sadr was someone who stood against and was knowledgeable. He was an amazing scholar of the religion of Islam, and he was killed by Saddam. Shaheed Baqir al-Sadr had a sister named Bint al-Huda. Bint al-Huda was also an amazing scholar who wrote and spoke against the government and taught the people and educated them. When these two, brother and sister, were captured by Saddam, very famously it's narrated that Saddam said, I will not make the mistakes of my predecessors, I will not leave the women alive where I kill the men. And Sayyidah Bint al-Huda with her brother, Shaheed Baqir al-Sadr, both were killed. And this is one of the instructions. It says that in the end of times, the condition that we will face will be worse and more difficult than even those conditions that were levied upon the Ahlul Bayt. Why do I mention this? If the conditions are worse, it means the responsibility is greater. That the work that needs to be done is more important. The education that needs to be done for standing up for Islam is more significant now than ever before. And it falls on all of us to fulfill that obligation and to know to defend Islam and to stand up for the religion, which is why we look at the examples and the lessons taught in Karbala. Which brings us to our third question. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. This question, continuing on the previous one, comes to the idea of why were the women present in Karbala? The Imam knew from when he left Medina that he is going to go face a very difficult trial, and that the challenges ahead of him would be very hard. To the extent where we say when our Imam left the city of Medina and he went to bid his farewell to the grave of the Holy Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, upon the idea of being separated from the Holy Prophet, he said, Ya Rasulullah, he has a dream, he sees the Holy Prophet. And he bids his farewell to the Prophet in his dream, and he says to the Holy Prophet, he says, Ya Rasulullah, can't I just stay here with you? Do I have to leave? And the Prophet replies to him and he says, Oh Hussain, Allah has prepared for you a place in heaven that is so high, it cannot be attained without offering a great sacrifice. So the Imam knew that a great sacrifice has to be made and a difficult moment is coming ahead, and it was something that not just the Imam knew about or the Prophet knew about, but that the Anbiya prior knew that there was a likelihood of a great sacrifice that would have to be made coming in the future. And there are the story of Nabi Yahya, whose shahadat is second only to Imam Hussain, who very famously was the answering of the dua of Nabi Zakaria that I want a son that I love the same way Rasulullah will love his son Hussain. There is Nabi Ibrahim who cries when he hears that the waqi' of Karbala will take place. There are many amongst the Anbiya that have an affiliation with the concept, not the concept, the waqi' of Karbala even before the advent of the event of Karbala. There are narrations that describe that Imam Ali, when he went to the land of Karbala as returning from Siffin, sat in the field of Karbala and wept. Ha huna qad kutila rijaluna, ha huna subiya nisa'una. That this is the place where our men will be killed, this is the place where our women will be taken prisoner. Imam Ali was announcing this. So why then did the Imam have to take these women and children with him? The importance in understanding this question is to understand that there is equity, if not equality, between men and women. The difference between these 2 points is very important. American culture teaches equality, Islam teaches equity. Equality is that everybody gets to do the same exact thing. Equity is you may do different things, but they're rewarded the same way in front of Allah. Equality means that if the men fight in the field of Karbala, then the women fight in the field of Karbala. Equity is that the men fulfill their obligation to the religion of Islam with the sword. The women have another way by which they fulfill their obligation to Islam. In the religion of Islam, men and women have different gender roles. And to be very specific, there are only two genders. And they're different, they're not the same. Longer conversation, we can push that to the side for the moment. But what we see is at times Allah gives different obligations for men and women. But the reward is the same. When we talk about usul ad-din, the fundamentals and the philosophy of faith, that philosophy of faith doesn't change if you're a boy or a girl. We don't say, oh, are you a boy? Here's your usul. Oh, you're a girl? Here's your usul. No, the fundamentals of the faith are the same. Allah is the same. Nabuwat is the same. Quran is the same. Imamat is the same. Ma'ad is the same. Heaven is the same. Hell is the same. This is equity. But how we get to those conclusions and what are our obligations to fulfill, Allah has made unique for each of these genders so as to maximize their ability of what they can accomplish and how they can more easily fulfill this goal. Islam is the most perfect example of justice. Which is why in our fundamental of philosophy, if you'll notice, the one thing I didn't mention so that I could elaborate on it is justice is one of the fundamental concepts of the philosophy of Islam. And that justice is that everyone has their unique responsibilities and Allah judges us upon those unique capabilities that we possess, which is an important basic tool that we have. The women being present in Karbala, the function was not that they should go to the battlefield. The function was that there will come a place and a time where the message of Karbala cannot be presented by men, and that's where women will present the religion. Shall I explain? You guys are with me? Everybody's awake? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We're good on time, right? We have time, right? You have time, okay. To understand this, you have to go back in history a bit. You see, in the year 18 after Hijrah, the second Khalifa sent the Banu Umayyah to conquer the lands of Sham and Levant as it's known. The person who actually conquered it was a person by the name of Abu Ubaidah al-Jarrah. He was the third one present in Saqifa who helped steal the authority of Imam Ali away from him. Abu Ubaidah al-Jarrah was killed in the battle. The one who took over his place was known as Yazid ibn Abu Sufyan, the brother of Muawiyah. Yazid completed the conquest of the lands of Sham, and as he completed that conquest, he died. So Muawiyah turns to the second Khalifa and he says, hey, listen, my brother did this job, he did this great thing, you made him in charge, he died, give it to me. And the second Khalifa liked Muawiyah, so he says, okay, go ahead, you can have it. Muawiyah took control of Sham in the year 18 after Hijrah. And he locked it down. He didn't let any of the companions of the Prophet come to Sham. He didn't let anyone from Medina come to Sham. He wanted to be the only example of what is Islam and who are Muslims in the land of Sham, so that no one would ever question his authority as a leader. Now understand something. If Muawiyah lives amongst these people that he just conquered this land and made them all Muslimin and they all became Muslims by the hands of the Banu Umayyah, now Muawiyah comes and tells them, you know, the best people in Islam are us Banu Umayyah. There's no one better. Allah talked about us. The angels came to me, did this, did that. If anybody else who could know the truth of those statements was there, they would say, ha, he's lying. So what did Muawiyah do? He refused to let any man or any representation of Islam into these lands of Sham under the threat of persecution. And even to the extent where the third Khalifa who gave him power and was his family member was having a problem with Abu Dhar. So he takes Abu Dhar, puts him on a donkey and sends him to Sham, and he says, Muawiyah, keep him there because he causes too much trouble in Medina. As soon as Abu Dhar enters into Sham, Muawiyah says, you're not staying here, and kicks him out again. Because he says, this guy speaks too much truth. If I let him stay here, he's going to expose all of the things that I've said, and no one will believe that we're good people. Muawiyah had set the example that the best of Islam, that the Ahlul Bayt, na'uzubillah, of Islam were the Banu Umayyah. And because no one from Sham had ever seen the Holy Prophet's family, had never met anyone else associated with the messenger, people in Sham accepted this. When you talk about that people were so willing to get themselves killed for Muawiyah and Siffin, it was because they never met anyone who really truly represented Islam. They had never seen anyone like that. Now fast forward to when Imam Hassan signs the treaty with Muawiyah. When Imam Hassan signs the treaty with Muawiyah and Muawiyah becomes the Khalifa, now he starts to slowly open the doors and let people kind of come and go, because now he's like, I am the Khalifa, so they can't challenge me now. I have the power, I can do whatever I want. Let them come and go now. And people start to come and go, and they start to see that there are better people than the Banu Umayyah out there. That the real message of Islam is something else. When this happens is why Muawiyah is forced to assassinate Imam Hassan. The assassination of Imam Hassan is because his example was too good. The people saw him and they questioned, why are we following Muawiyah when we have someone like this that exists? This is the grandson of the Prophet? Muawiyah is what? Where did he come from? As this process goes on, Muawiyah realizes, if this example and excellent personality remains, then I'll lose my authority. So he sets into place the process of assassination and killing off and removing people who can show and expose his indecency. Now when the event of Karbala takes place, the Banu Umayyah have a policy in place already, that any man who speaks against the Banu Umayyah, get rid of him. How does this get corrected? Is the example of the women who are taken as prisoners. They come and expose the character of Banu Umayyah where the men can't. The ladies are the ones who bring to light the message of Imam Hussain and the indecency of Banu Umayyah. Had they not been there, the men had no chance of ever speaking against the Khalifa and exposing the indecency of what happened in Karbala. They would have been immediately killed as soon as they said anything. Understand how important this is. Let's talk about it in fact and function. Can you imagine that 30,000 men kill 120 people in the morning of one day? The Battle of Ashura lasted a morning, lasted until afternoon. And yet till today, 1,400 years later, millions upon millions of people recount this event, tell this story, and cry for what happened in Karbala. This is the effort and the impact of the women of Karbala. Their being present in Karbala was to convey to humanity the indecency and the injustice that happened to the Imam. To make sure that the message reached all of those people, even if they were ignorant of who was Imam Hussain. Part of this is the reason why we see, for example, when they enter into Sham, an old man comes to our fourth Imam and says, Alhamdulillah, praise to Allah who killed you and gave us victory over you. What does the Imam do? The Imam says, oh old man, have you read the Quran? He says, I have. He says, where Allah says, قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا إِلَّا الْمَوَدَّةَ فِي الْقُرْبَى. I do not ask for you any word except for love for my near ones. Have you read this verse? He says, I have. Imam Zain Abin says, نَحْنُ. We are the ones who are the family of the Prophet. He says, the verse of Ayat-i-Tathir, have you read this? Yes, we are Ayat-i-Tathir. The verse of Mubahila, we are the children of Rasulullah. We are the ones upon whom Allah sends His praise and blessings. As the Imam is being exposed to this, he comes to the realization of what he has done, and he says, he there instantly goes and fights against the army of Umar Asad and is killed and buried. And he says, let me die as a lover of you, family of the Prophet, if this is possible. That impact was driven by the fact that the women were there to both protect the Imam and to speak on behalf of the Ahlul Bayt. One of the most powerful things that happens in the court of Yazid is when Sayyidah Zainab begins speaking. When Sayyidah Zainab begins speaking, she exposes to humanity who are Banu Umayyah. with one name. One thing she says shows exactly who Banu Umayyah are. You guys ready? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Salawat's getting weak, man. I'm going to wrap this up if you guys don't keep up. We're only on question number 3. There's 4 after this. A louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sayyidah Zainab decimates Yazid and the Banu Umayyah with one name. You see, when the Prophet conquered the city of Mecca, he conquered it peacefully. But the right of the conqueror, according to the rules of the Arab, was anyone who he conquers, he can take as a slave. All of the Quraysh, the day the Prophet conquered the city of Mecca, became the slaves of the Prophet. And because he did it peacefully, no other Muslim had a share in this effort. They all belonged to the Prophet. And the Prophet in that day, he says, I don't want any of you as my slaves. I set you all free. All of those Quraysh who were set free by the Prophet on the day when he conquered the city of Mecca became known as tulaqa, freed slaves. Sayyidah Zainab, when she enters into the court of Yazid, and Yazid starts talking about how wonderful it is that Allah gave them victory over the Ahlul Bayt, and that Allah killed his enemies, and that he took revenge against the children of Ali for what Imam Ali had done to his ancestors in the field of Badr. Sayyidah Zainab begins and she says to him, she says, Yabnat tulaqa, O son of the one who is a freed slave by my grandfather, what right do you have anything to say about my family, those who are the true progeny and have never been enslaved by any man? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sayyidah Zainab making the statement, Yabnat tulaqa, O son of a freed slave, that your father was my grandfather's slave. Your grandfather was my father's slave. Who are you now to stand here in authority and claim any authority over us when your existence is on the basis of our mercy to you that we made you a freed man? Otherwise, you have no right except to be our slave. This exposure of the difference between Ahlul Bayt and Banu Umayyah was something only the women could have done. And it was something that the reason why they were included and what their role was. Never imagine to say that the women had no role because they did not stand on the battlefield. No, the fact that the battlefield is something we discuss still today is because of the role that the women took in defending and ensuring that the sacrifice of Ahlul Bayt was preserved. Because they could speak where no man could speak. And this is the concept of equity, that both present a great sacrifice. Which brings us to our final question. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now this is going to hurt you initially, but I'm going to explain why. Did the Ahlul Bayt deserve what happened to them in Karbala? The answer is no. You may even be upset with me. How could I ask such a question? Did the Ahlul Bayt deserve to be abused? Did the Ahlul Bayt deserve to be killed? You see, the question seems absurd, but you do it to yourselves every day. When a difficulty befalls us, or someone that we know, what do we say? He deserves it. She deserves it. They must have done something wrong. They must not be good people that they went through this difficulty. You see, the people of that time said the same thing about Ahlul Bayt as well too. But today, us as followers of Ahlul Bayt know Ahlul Bayt didn't deserve this. They didn't do anything wrong. Then why did they go through such a great difficulty? This is where we have to correct our perspective. We imagine, and wrongfully so, we imagine that life should be like heaven. No problems, everything is great. And if I go through a problem, it's because of, right? What do we say? Nazar. Someone did nazar. Someone gave me an evil eye. Or 2, I must have done something very bad, and which is why I am going through this difficulty. That's a mistake. This world is not a place of pleasure. Had it been the fact that this world is supposed to be a place of pleasure and ease, no one deserved ease more than the Ahlul Bayt. But the Ahlul Bayt went through great difficulties. The best of humanity and society went through very hard times. That's an explanation for us that what is this world? This world is a place of difficulties and troubles and tribulations. The verse that we began our discussion with today is a verse in which Allah is making a statement. He says, أَحَسِبَ النَّاسُ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يَفْتَنُونَ. Does mankind believe that they will say, we keep faith and they won't be tested? The explanation of this statement is that if you are a mu'min, not just by name, but by character, but even by name. If you are a mu'min, no, hang on, that won't work. If you're a mu'min by character, you will face difficulties in this life. This is a life of bala. This is a life of difficulty. To be able to be entitled to a reward and paradise in heaven, you have to go through an examination. When we look at the example of the Ahlul Bayt suffering and going through these difficulties, remember what Rasulullah said to Imam Hussain, your status for your difficulties that you go through is very great in heaven. That if we want to attain greatness in heaven, there's no way that we can get there without tribulations and difficulties. And the best example for that is that when you see the tribulations of Ahlul Bayt, ask about the same question that you want to ask about Ali, Muhammad and Abbas that go through difficulty. When we see someone in our community go through difficulty, what do we say? Oh, he must be, na'uz billah, a bad person. He must do bad things. He must have done something wrong. He must have a bad character. And we say that's why he's going through these difficulties. No. Difficulties and trials are the fundamental of attaining Jannah in the hereafter. The Ahlul Bayt going through them is an example for us to show and to tell you that just because you go through difficulties in this life doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means that the better you are, the greater the difficulty you go through. The closer you get to Allah, the more trials and tribulations you will get, because there was no one closer to Allah than the Ahlul Bayt. And if they went through difficulties, then we should be someone who is thankful for the difficulty, because it means we're getting closer to Ahlul Bayt. This idea of understanding why tribulations happen, not because you're being punished, but because they raise your status closer to Ahlul Bayt. Now understand, when Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad in his court wants to torture and abuse Sayyidah Zainab, he asks, كيف وجدت ما فعلك بك ربك في كربلاء? How did you find what your Lord did to you in Karbala? Sayyidah Zainab, understanding the significance of these bala, turns and says, وَمَا رَأَيْتُ إِلَّا جَمِيلًا. I did not see anything but beauty in the tribulations my Lord affixed for us. This Sayyidah Zainab is that person who didn't just represent the cause of Imam Hussain, but she was one who sacrificed in the way of Imam Hussain as well too. Remember, there are two sons that she took with her to the field of Karbala. There are two sons who were killed in the way of Imam Hussain. This Sayyidah Zainab is that one who, in spite of these sacrifices, never turned and looked to her own sacrifice, but rather did ta'zeem and demonstrated the greatness of the sacrifice of Imam Hussain. In Sham, before the Ahlul Bayt left Sham, Mal'un Yazid asked, is there anything you want? Imam Zainul Abidin replied, he said, we have some conditions before we leave. Amongst these conditions, the Imam said, there are certain things that were stolen from us and looted from us on the day of Ashura. We want them returned to us. And then he says, there are the heads of our shuhada that you have taken. We want them returned to us. When these women and Imam Zainul Abidin sat in the prison, the heads of the Ahlul Bayt were brought back to them. Every woman would take the head of her loved one and would weep and would complain of the sacrifices that she had gone through, until eventually the head of Abul Fadil came. Abul Fadil's head, when it came, Kulthum came forward and said, give me the head of my brother. And she wept, holding the head of Abbas. Then the head of Imam Hussain came. Sayyidah Zainab stepped forward, took the head of Aba Abdullah, held it close, and all of the women circled around her, and they would cry as they looked upon the face of Aba Abdullah, until eventually the heads of two boys were brought forward and placed in the room. Yet no one stepped forward to accept them until Fizza came and says, "Give to me these children." Someone asked, "Are these orphans that were killed for Hussain?" And the reply came, "Hasha lillah, their mother is Zainab." They said, "Then why does she not cry over these children? Why does she not hold the heads of her sons?" Sayyidah Zainab says, "I am the daughter of Ali ibn Abi Talib. When we give sadaqah, we don't ask about it. My Hussain was the son of Zahra. My son, my brother Hussain is the one who I weep over." Sayyidah Zainab did not weep over her own children, even in that moment of great difficulty. They describe and they say that Sayyidah Zainab was that one who never wept over her children until she comes back to the city of Medina. In the city of Medina, at one point in time, Imam Zainul Abidin says, "Oh my aunt, it is right that you should go back to your house and go back to your family. We have been together through many great Messiah, but oh my aunt, it is time for you to return to your house." Imam Zainul Abidin takes Sayyidah Zainab to the door of her house. He intends to bid farewell, but neither has the words to say to the other that, "How do I leave you after we have experienced the tribulations that we have, after we have buried Sakina in Sham, after we have visited Abu Abdullah?" They hold each other on the doorstep of the house of Ja'far, Abdullah ibn Ja'far, and they cry until eventually the weakness overcomes them. They sit in front of the door of the house of Sayyidah Zainab, crying in weakness, until the husband of Sayyidah Zainab comes. He sees two weak people sitting on his doorstep crying. Abdullah ibn Ja'far, the husband of Sayyidah Zainab, is a wealthy man who is known for his charity. He calls into the people of his house. He says, "Did I not tell you, when a beggar comes to our door, do not wait for me to give them. Give them from yourself and send them on the way. You have my permission." The women come to the door and they say, "Oh Abdullah ibn Ja'far, this is not a beggar who came to your door. This is Sayyidah Zainab and Zainul Abidin who have come to your door, who sit upon your door from their tribulations and cry." Sayyidah Zainab entered her house, came to a room in which two beds were made. She sat between these beds in a room of silence where the sounds of her children would be made. She sits between them and now she cries and complains and says, "Oh my sons, where has your mother left you? Why has your mother not seen you or heard your voices in this house? Oh my sons, forgive me that your mother did not ask about you, but that your mother made the aza of Imam al-Hussain." ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسليما لأمره ندعوك باسمك العظيم الأعظم الأعز الأجل الأكرم. With tears in our eyes, we raise our hands at the time of Maghrib. 10 times we call out, Ya Allah, 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 Ya Mahmud بحق محمد يا أعلى بحق علي يا فاطر السماوات بحق فاطمة يا محسن بحق الحسن يا قديم الأحسان بحق الحسين. Oh Allah, accept this small ibadat from us. Ya Allah, give the thawab of this majlis to our marhumin, all of the marhumin of this community and all those who are in need of dua. Oh Allah, we ask that by the right of this night, by the right of the tears in our eyes, by the right of Ahlul Bayt, fulfill our hajat. Ya Allah, keep our children on the upright path of Islam. Ya Allah, those amongst our families, our communities, the mu'mineen who are suffering through sickness and disease, Ya Allah, give shafa'at to the mu'mineen wherever they are. Oh Allah, there are those amongst us who have come here with hajat. By the right of the mention of Ali Muhammad, fulfill our hajat. Keep our children on the upright path of Islam. Hasten the reappearance of Sahib al-Zaman and entitle us to the ziyarat of Imam Hussain in this world and the shafa of Imam Hussain in Akhirah. One Surah Fatiha with your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Salli ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. ماتم يا حسين.
Thank you. Ya Hussain, Ya Hussain. Qanwa, 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 Qanwa. یسرب سے سوئے کربلا ایک کارواں رخصت ہوا، سر پہ علم سایہ فغن غازی کی آتی ہے صدا، پہلا سفر زینب کا ہے سنسان کر دو راستہ، کارواں کارواں عباس میرے کارواں، کارواں کارواں عباس میرے، کیا شان ہے کیا دبدبہ کیا لوگ ہے قرآن ماں، صلی علی آیات کا ہے قافلہ، مشق و علم ان کا نشاں، عباس میرے کارواں کارواں کارواں، اللہ کے پیارے ہے یہ آل نبی سارے ہے یہ، قرآن کے پارے ہے یہ کونین کے تارے ہے یہ، زیر قدم ہے آسماں عباس میرے کارواں 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 عباس میرے کارواں، یا حسین پر محمد والے محمد صلوات۔ السلام علیکم یا ابن رسول اللہ، السلام علیکم یا ابن علی المرتضیٰ، السلام علیکم یا ابن فاطمۃ الزہرا، السلام علیکم یا حسن مجتبیٰ، السلام علیکم یا ابا عبداللہ وعلی الارواح